Hey, what is going on, ladies and the gentlemen? My name is Quarbit, and yes, I sincerely believe Europa Universalis 5 is actually going to be announced sooner than we originally thought. Here's my prediction. ParadoxCon 2020. You might think that I'm a madman, or that I just have no idea what I'm talking about, both of which are often the case. However, today I've collected what I consider strong points of evidence towards the existence of EU5 and when it might be announced. All of my sources will be in the description if you're curious and want to take a look for yourself. Before that though, we have to tackle the biggest question in the room. Is EU5 even going to be a game in the first place? Buckle in, because this will be a long question to answer. Back in June of 2017, studio manager and game designer Johan Andersson said in an interview, quote, "We wouldn't make EU5 just for the sake of it. There's no cutoff point when we would automatically move on to a sequel." Essentially, he's saying he wouldn't just make it for an extra detail or two or for just updated graphics. Now, from a development point of view, this is a brilliant idea. You don't have to integrate any new engines, remake all new models, or update the graphics just for the sake of making a new game with new tech. Although I couldn't quite find the source of it, I believe there was once a quote at ParadoxCon 2018 saying, "In theory, an EU5 doesn't need to exist. We could just keep adding things to EU4. Whether or not this is a true quote that was said, thinking about it makes a lot of sense. A Europa Universalis 5 would also need to be rather different from EU4 to have a good selling point. As Johan also stated, updated graphics would not be a selling point in of itself. It has to have a reason to exist, and we need to feel like we can't make those changes in the existing titles." Another good point that affects both sides of this argument is that EU4's player base is currently in a pretty good position. Well, generally speaking, and is doing especially well for having only gotten one update in the past full year. On one hand, that means the attention of a sizable player base will be kept no matter what Paradox does, so of course why not just take the path of least resistance? On the other hand, with EU4 only looking to increase massively in popularity once this next expansion hits, the announcement of a new entry in the series a few months down the road would be able to capitalize off of EU4's increase in relevancy. So far, it sounds a bit like EU5 may never come into existence after all, due to the fact it's not really needed. However, let's talk about the stuff that goes on behind the scenes of game design. After all, money and revenue shape the industry, and who else knows that better than Paradox? It's what's led to the creation of things like loot boxes and battle passes in games like Overwatch and Fortnite respectively. Money is a primary factor in altering how and when games are designed. In a case like Paradox, they love their DLC, and I mean absolutely adore it. If you consider that Paradox is a rather one-of-a-kind type of studio though, it starts to make sense. Adding a DLC once, twice, or even 4 times a year as it seems, is the only way to have enough money to keep expanding the company without taking on the massive task of creating new games every single year from scratch. And however useful this tactic was to begin with, something like this can never last forever. After all, where would it end? When the game costs $400? $500? An expansion model like this could only be resolved by slowly releasing the old DLC for free, so that the increasing cost to a new player reaches a certain cap. For any game, a $280 price tag for the full experience is already extremely high, and even through various sales and sites that provide discounts like G2A, it unfortunately causes a really massive problem: piracy. People just aren't as willing to spend 3 figures on a game made 7 years ago as Paradox might account for when planning the future. So if there's any big reason to make an EU5 rather soon, it would be the long-term sales after the 1.30 expansion. Now that we've established that EU5 will probably exist for monetary reasons, let's talk about when it will exist and why I think it's so soon. One of the biggest pieces of evidence is the 1.30 patch and the accompanying expansion. This currently untitled expansion as it stands looks like it might release in early to mid-February, or possibly even late January. From what we've seen, this next expansion will have a load of new content to explore. For more details on what we know so far, check out this 25-minute long video made by Radio Res if you haven't already. It explains in great detail what he dubs the PAX Europa update. But let's hold off for a second and think to ourselves, how did they manage to fit so much into this next update? Well, it also happens to be that we haven't seen an EU4 expansion since Golden Century, which was released just over a full year ago. And it's true that we got the 1.29 Manchu update, but it wasn't really labeled as an expansion. Trust me, the fact that it wasn't an expansion also has a lot of relevance. Paradox has never let a full year go by without making at least 2 expansions except for 2019. Now, I understand they're entirely reworking the game for the PAX Europa update, which must have taken a very long time. However, there's also another almost identical case here. Crusader Kings 2 followed a similar model, releasing more than one DLC every year up until 2018, which saw exactly 1 year between Jade Dragon and Holy Fury. The only exception was with the release of Horse Lords, but even then there were only 7 months between prior and following DLCs. So that doesn't really mean anything. And now we know that approximately 10 months after Holy Fury was the announcement of CK3. I'm starting to see a few parallels here. 1 year gap between the DLCs, and the DLCs that were released or will be released soon enough changed the game in drastic ways. Oh, and if that's not quite enough to convince you, I have a little bit more. There's a clip from the podcast called No CB, which you should definitely go and check out, by the way, it's absolutely fantastic. But anyway, there's a clip from the pilot where Lambert, one of the hosts, says that a former staff person at ParadoxCon told him that EU4 is getting, quote, the Holy Fury treatment with this next expansion. Do you see what I'm getting at here? A lack of expansions leading up to a massive one, where less than a year later we saw the announcement of CK3. It was exactly at that moment when I was listening to the podcast where absolutely everything clicked in my mind, because just a few seconds prior, Lambert also explains his theory about DDR Jake, the ex-game director, leaving the company. He believes that either Martin or Johan didn't have anything left for Jake to do, and they already found someone to direct EU5 for them. This would make a good deal of sense in my opinion. I would think a game director leaving his position while there are still apparently years of content left to plan would be a little bit odd. But hey, it could just happen to be coincidence and he found a better opportunity. Now, let's take a second to return to my speculative claim, which is EU5 will be announced at ParadoxCon 2020. Now, in 2019, ParadoxCon was moved to Berlin and subsequently also pushed to October. Usually, ParadoxCon happens in May, but if the current trend continues, I think we can plan on seeing EU5 getting an announcement. Personally, I think the PAX Europa update was supposed to be released in December or early January, but that the development team started encountering problems and development started to slow down. This might also be evidenced by the slower release of development diaries as of recent, which were changed from a weekly to a monthly schedule. Now, the next development diary is set to release in a few days. Whether we'll hear the release date of this next expansion or not is still up in the air. It seems at this point that we won't read about any new game-changing mechanics, but I'm always open to see what they have in store for us. As previously mentioned, if ParadoxCon is also in October this year, then the EU5 announcement would come only 8 or 9 months after the final update for EU4, and very closely mimics the final stages of CK2, which coincidentally also released only a year before EU4. I should also mention that as of right now, the ticket sales for ParadoxCon 2020 haven't started yet, when they usually start around 5 months before the convention's date. Strictly speaking though, a quarter of this theory is pretty much ruined if they do shift the date back to May, but it would be a little bit odd just to change it for 1 year, I think. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed my crackpot theory. I could go on and on about what EU5 could bring to the table, but that would all be completely speculation based on nothing. All we can say for now is that we're rapidly approaching a big event that I hope you'll all join me for. Above all else, I want to know what your opinion is on the matter. Will EU5 be announced at ParadoxCon 2020, or will there even be an EU5 at all? Let's talk about it. Also, welcome to my first big video of 2020. This year, my first ambition is to hit 10,000 subscribers, for which I'll be giving away something a little bit special. If you want to know what that is, then of course, hitting the subscribe button is your best bet. Anyways, this is Quarbit signing off, and as always, have a fantastic day. I would like to give a massive shout out to the following amazing patrons. In the $1 tier, we have Quiet Guy, Quaggersol, Rising Runner, and Dylan M. In the $5 tier, we have Mezzid Max. And in the $20 tier, we have Chewy Shoot. You guys are doing an amazing job helping me to move this channel forward, and I cannot possibly thank you enough.